So, if that's okay from everyone, is it okay from the committee? Yep, we'll begin. We are live streaming now onto YouTube as well. So, just to begin, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us. As you can see, multiple languages on the screen here representing Southeast Asia. Welcome, selamat datang, because we're starting off with a Malaysian company. So just wanted to start off with some house rules for everyone before I begin. Just some, details here. And this is quite important so that we ensure that we run on track and everything is smooth. So please make sure that, viewers, you're encouraged to turn on your videos throughout the session so that we can see who is speaking and we can see all you guys coming in from all over the world, essentially. Make sure you're muted unless we allow you to unmute or we advise you to unmute. And if you have questions, please do ask questions. We have an interactive session after the initial presentation, and we do want your questions in. Use the Zoom chat, and we encourage two types of questions. One is you can put your question fully in the text, and I will ask your question for you. And secondly, or if you want to, you can just text in the chat. Say, for example, if I have a question, I'll say, I have a question for Mr. Azran, and you just put it in, and I'll cue you in, and then you can ask your questions. So it goes very smoothly. And lastly, use speaker view on your Zoom. Figure out how to get speaker view on your Zoom, so then it will be the best thing. You don't get to see everyone else. You'll focus in on who's speaking at the moment. So yeah, we'll put this in the chat time to time so you remember. But other than that, one second. Other than that, I think we are ready to go. I'll stop sharing my screen and I will introduce the speaker. But before, let me just introduce myself and OxSEA. So I'm Parin. I'm studying psychology and philosophy at the University of Oxford, the second year. And I am the vice president of the Malaysian Society. And with my committee here, we've initiated OxSEA, the first ever Oxford Southeast Asian Speaker Festival. We realized that in Oxford, there's not been much coverage about Southeast Asia at the moment. And so, yeah, there's not much coverage of Southeast Asia at the moment. And so what we decided to do was we wanted to have this event to bring together the best talents across Southeast Asia and share them to the people at Oxford and to the world at large to make sure that the talents and the innovative entrepreneurs that we have in Southeast Asia do get a voice, do get heard. And that more people in Oxford hear about Southeast Asia. So without much further ado, I will introduce our wonderful speaker that we have here today, Mr. Azran.
Just
So,
Azran.
Azran, all right. Yeah, one second. So, I will try to keep this brief, but Azran here is the current founder of the tech startup Naluri, based in Malaysia, which aims to provide digitalized therapeutics that have been localized and personalized to the consumer or patient. He combines behavioral sciences and technology, psychology, data science, and digital design, and essentially aims to make healthy lifestyle habits stick and become long-lasting. A bit more about the man behind it all. Azran is a Stanford alumnus, having graduated with a master's in management science and engineering, after which he pursued a career in consulting with Booz Allen Hamilton and McKinsey. He was the senior VP in Bursa Malaysia, the Malaysian Stock Exchange, and the senior director at Astro, Malaysia's largest satellite TV network provider. He then went on to be the CEO of AirAsia X Berhad, the long-haul budget airline sister company of AirAsia. I'm sure most of us in Asia have familiar with that name. Just before founding Naluri, he was the CEO of Malaysia's online streaming service, the equivalent of Netflix in Malaysia, iFlix. And beyond work, I understand that you've also written your own book, 30 Days and 30 Years, the sprint and marathon of breakthrough performance. You've also taken part in the Ironman triathlon yourself, and you're a professional speaker, speaking even at the regional tech conferences. So I think it really does seem, everywhere you put your hand, it turns to gold almost, like the story. So I will stop speaking and I'll let you introduce yourself and maybe share a couple minutes on talking about Naluri and the story of Naluri and behind it.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Parin. Hello, everyone. I think in summary, what it basically says is I've had a long journey. I've made a lot of mistakes and lost a lot of hair. And in that process, hopefully I'll be able to distill some of those in terms of lessons that you can take away so that you don't make the same mistakes that I did and still keep your hair. But let me start with a little bit about um, starting companies and startups. And there are really two fundamental ingredients. The first is the problem that you want to tackle. Is it big enough? Is it relevant enough? And is it unique relative to what else is out there? And the second part is, why are you the right person to build this particular business and startup? So let's use Naluri as a context. And the best way for me to describe the challenge that we see, the problem that we want to tackle is this. First, today in the world that we live in, more people die from diabetes alone, which is a completely controllable and preventable lifestyle disease, than all of the infectious diseases combined, even COVID-19, influenza, dengue, malaria, HIV, all of the infectious diseases that are caused by viruses or bacteria. Diabetes alone kills more people around the world and in Southeast Asia than all the infectious diseases combined. Today, in our world, more people die from suicide than all of wars, murders, and terrorism combined. Now, while we all of us recognize these two crises of humanity, few are understanding and tackling this together. There are actually deep interrelations between chronic diseases like diabetes and heart diseases and cancer, and its effect on mental health, depression, anxiety, and stress. So there are strong correlations between those with diabetes and depression, with anxiety and heart diseases. And so we feel that it's time that healthcare is reimagined in a way to address this condition differently than what it is today. So if I were to lay out three phases of what we call healthcare models, healthcare 1.0, healthcare 2.0, and healthcare 3.0. So healthcare 1.0 effectively is having patients or people who are unwell physically go and see doctors in hospitals or clinics. And healthcare 2.0 is, a lot of the focus today is on telemedicine technologies, essentially using sort of typical marketplace technologies like ride hailing or e-commerce, putting it in the context of healthcare so that patients are matched with healthcare professionals, often through sessions like this, similar sort of Zoom live sessions. So that is the telemedicine model. And let me tell you about how we're trying to build healthcare 3.0 to reimagine how healthcare is delivered, specifically for this intersection between chronic diseases and mental health. And so there are three main problems that we see with healthcare today, whether it's the 1.0 or the 2.0 model. And I also want to talk about a fourth problem, especially in the context of emerging markets in Southeast Asia. Number one, healthcare is reactive and it is transactional, meaning we wait for people to feel unwell and are sick and expect them to come out and reach out for help. And number two, that care is transactional or episodic, which means it is a single consultation. But 70% of healthcare today are these chronic conditions that cannot be solved with a single consultation, a single prescription, and a single treatment, right? These conditions like diabetes and heart diseases and cancer or even mental health require ongoing care. But if that ongoing care requires us to connect in live sessions, whether in person or via Zoom-like sessions, multiple times, number one, it can get inconvenient and it can also become quite costly. The second issue is that healthcare has become so siloed by specialization, right? If you book a session with a cardiologist, she is only going to look at your heart. If you book a session with a gastroenterologist, he's only going to look at your gut, right? A psychologist or psychiatrist helps you with your mental health. A dietitian helps with you with your diet and nutritional needs, etc. But these chronic conditions, as I addressed earlier, are deeply interrelated. And so what we're trying to imagine is if healthcare moves from this specialist model where the patient has to figure out all these different parts to a multidisciplinary team that is coordinated and serves the patient in the middle, right? So imagine having your own psychologist, your own dietitian, your own set of doctors with different specializations, your own pharmacists, fitness coaches, working as a team to help provide very personalized guidance and structured advice for you. And the third problem is healthcare is paid, or the economics of it is based on an activity, whether that activity is a consultation, whether that activity is I give you a prescription, or in a lot of digital health technologies today, like wearables, right? You track activities like steps or calories that you eat, or how many hours that you sleep. But activity doesn't necessarily equate to health improvement. And what we want to do is to try to change the dynamic between people who have to pay for healthcare and people who are providing healthcare to a model where it's based on actual quantifiable health improvements. Because the payers of healthcare, whether they are corporate employers themselves, insurers, governments, and in some cases, individuals who are paying for healthcare themselves, are getting frustrated that their costs of healthcare in Southeast Asia today are growing at over a double-digit rate, from 10% at the low end to 17 or even 21% in the case of Malaysia and Vietnam. So the cost of healthcare is escalating, but yet people are still getting more and more sick. So something is not right, right? Because a doctor, you might pay for a consultation and you might pay for treatment, but guess what? In Malaysia, for example, 74% of people, when told by their doctor that they're overweight or they're hypertensive, which means they've got high blood pressure, their cholesterol's high, their blood sugar's high, and they need to change the diet, exercise a bit more, manage their stress, and get better sleep, they say, yes, doctor, but they go home, 74% continue with their existing lifestyles. And so simply giving advice, giving a prescription, consulting doesn't really work, right? And if we're going to make a real difference to healthcare in Southeast Asia, we want to reimagine this model. So to recap, number one, how do we move it from reactive and episodic or transactional to a model that is proactive? That means we scan and identify people so that we identify those with early risk factors and provide a structured ongoing model of care. And two, that care is delivered by a multidisciplinary team rather than specialized silos. And third, the payment or the economics of that is based on success triggers or outcomes, right? Whether it is material improvements in your blood pressure, in your cholesterol, in your blood sugar, material improvements in your depression and anxiety that we can quantify, because we know that will ultimately means lower medical costs down the line. So that is kind of the healthcare 3.0, that we define the problem clearly so that we can build something that addresses it. Now, in Southeast Asia specifically, there is a fourth problem, which is we do not have enough healthcare professionals to support the 600 plus million people, 400 million adults, of which almost half with early, moderate, or advanced risk factors of diabetes from high blood sugar, hypertension and heart disease risks, cancer risks, and mental health risks. And so, for example, in Malaysia, as a reference point, the whole country only has about 200 plus practicing clinical psychologists, 400 plus practicing psychiatrists, for a population where about 10 million adults actually have elevated levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. So the capacity in a traditional model can only serve about 600, 700,000 Malaysians and ignore over 9 million people who need help, but just simply cannot get access to help. So the model of live conversations, whether it is I have to go see someone at a specialist center or at a hospital or clinic, or today maybe I can go on the various telemedicine platforms and book a session, means many people still are not going to get help, right? And so what we're trying to do is say, is there a way that we can take that psychologist and take that dietitian and take that doctor, and if they have live sessions, for example, a psychologist is maxed out at about 50 clients a month. With Nullery, we are pushing 600 to 1. And so if we can tenfold the productivity, that means we can make the service 10 times more affordable and still make the economics work, and therefore be able to make it much more accessible to the broader mass market population in Southeast Asia, right? So that is what we're trying to do. And the main way we achieve that, right? Think about it this way. So contrast a telemedicine or telehealth type model where we have a live conversation, like for example, you're listening to me right now. First, I shift that conversation from live models to an asynchronous model, i.e. like chat, like having a WhatsApp thread conversation where you don't necessarily get live feedback, but continuous ongoing care is not about a single one-off consultation, but someone who's proactively checking on with you, every few days to see how you're progressing against a specific health plan or goal. Now, chat alone can double the productivity, just like, as you know, most of you are very familiar having multiple simultaneous chat threads on WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger. Now, if it was just chat, you don't need a new technology like Nullery. You could just use WhatsApp, which is much more accessible. But the problem with that is you're going to start to realize that as your psychologist, as your dietitian, as your doctor, first, I've got to ask you the same set of questions again and again and again to better understand you. And second, I've got to explain concepts, explain issues to you again and again and again. And so we then created digital bite-sized modules, right? So for example, if a psychologist at the start of your relationship wants to understand the stress triggers in your life, the psychologist might say, hey, Parin, when you've got 5 minutes later during the day, why don't you complete module number 4 on understanding the stress triggers? So you read a little bit about it, you understand, you are answering a standard set of questions. And then, as Nullery now has over 25,000 users, or what we call members of our program who've gone through this program, we can look at these response, and we've built algorithms to help the healthcare professionals real-time analyze things like emotions, resilience levels, readiness to change, and provide insights that one individual healthcare professional might not be able to catch it very quickly. Because if I'm now going to have 10 times the number of people for me to help, I don't have the capacity to just manually process where this person is, what's the history of ongoing discussion, where do they need to go, and to provide the kind of personalized guidance. But we use computer algorithms to kind of summarize the state of that individual and therefore provide the psychologist or the healthcare professional with input so that they can respond much faster. And this process, for example, especially in the last 12 months, where we've seen spikes in mental distress in Southeast Asia, depression, anxiety, and stress scores have gone up by about 40% relative to pre-COVID levels. We've even used our algorithms to detect and predict potential suicide ideation. Because the idea is today in Southeast Asia, about 1/3 of people are experiencing mental distress, but only about 2 to 3% are actually reaching out for help. So the reactive model where we expect people to reach out for help is not working. And so if we can do a better job at identifying people earlier on, engaging them with a digital health program, and through that process by using technologies like natural language processing, by quantifying text-based chat, and predicting who is in the mental distress, depressive states, and even suicide ideation, and we proactively reach out to them so that we can do a better job at managing their condition so that we reduce the numbers that go from suicide ideation to actual suicide attempt, and certainly then to those, unfortunately, who actually might succeed with their attempt. And some of the new technologies that we're working on is to make that assessment much more accurate by supplementing or augmenting the natural language processing technology with technologies like using microfacial expressions from the video camera through sort of getting people to record how they feel, analyzing the audio, right? So not just what they say, but the temper, the valence, the volumes as additional data points to feed into our predictive algorithm so that we become much more precise. Because sometimes someone might say, yes, I'm feeling okay, but actually the microfacial expressions and the tone of voice may indicate otherwise. And therefore, as professionals, we can be much more precise and accurate with our interventions. So in a nutshell, that is what Nullery is about. It is about creating a digital therapeutic, which is basically a chronic disease management program where a team of professional healthcare providers are coordinated, working with you, addressing not just your physical health, but also your mental health, using structured behavioral health algorithms to help you achieve a quantifiable improvement in your health and therefore help the payer of your healthcare, whether it's your employer or your insurer or the government, reduce your future medical costs. So in the nutshell, that is what we set out to do. Now, as I said earlier, that's kind of the problem that you want to tackle. And the second part is, why would you be the right person to tackle this? And certainly, for example, for me, I do not come from the healthcare industry. I'm not a trained psychologist. I'm not a trained medical doctor. But here's what I learned. Number one, great startups are not about a single person. It's about a team. And so while I'm not smart enough, I managed to find a co-founder who is an Oxford medicine graduate to be able to work together with me. And we now have a team of 70 people in Kuala Lumpur, Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, and Thailand to help us build this solution. And where I come from, and because many people sort of don't understand kind of like, I guess, my professional career progression, because I've been in industries as varied as highly regulated and capital intensive sectors like the airline industry, building an airline from scratch, to internet television and trying to build a Netflix for emerging markets, and now healthcare. That's because most people look at industries in the traditional industry definition. I look at it and I see I'm constantly trying to solve the same problem, which is, how do I look at any particular industry, understand how it works, and find ways to make things much more affordable and much more accessible? And those principles will cut across any industry. And secondly, in all cases, I work with people deeply experienced in those respective industries. So for example, my co-founder with AirAsia X was someone who had worked in the airline industry for 30 years. And so he knew exactly how everything worked in an airline model. And my job was to be the 5-year-old kindergarten kid who asked, why do you do things this way? Is there a different way of doing it? And likewise with iFlix, my co-founder Mark had built internet TV in Australia. So he had that domain knowledge, and my job was to, again, help him figure out how do we make this work for the mass market in Southeast Asia. And likewise now with Naluri, my co-founder, Dr. Jeremy, trained from Oxford and has been working as a healthcare specialist over the last decade or so, trying to kind of help insurers and healthcare systems create a new model of multidisciplinary care. So I think picking the right team means you can then convince investors why you are the right people and the right team to tackle the problem that you've defined. A lot of people might identify a problem, might come up with an idea, but if they can't convince investors definitively why they are the right people with the right experience, skill sets, and diversity of a team to tackle it, it may be very challenging to raise investor capital to get started. So hopefully that kind of gives you a little framework to think about, how do we not just conceive ideas, focusing on the problems, how big these problems are, but also ensuring that the team is the right team to tackle those problems. So with that, I'm going to pause right there, turn it back to our moderator, Parin, and look forward to engaging with you on questions, comments, and see, how we can build on from there. Back to you, Parin.
Thank you so much, Azan. Thank you for telling us about the story and giving us quite a nice detailed picture about how it looks like in Malaysia with chronic diseases and treatment. And again, just to our audience here, thank you for joining us. A reminder that we've put in the house rules in the chat, and if you'd like to ask a question, please put them in the chat box, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. Thank you. So just off your presentation, I noted that you talked about healthcare in the emerging market specifically and certain features about that they're transactional, episodic, they're quite specialized in the fields, in terms I go and see a cardiologist, I only get treatment for my heart, etc. I guess a question that I would put forward to you is that how do you engage with your stakeholders, Especially I've identified three stakeholders here: hospitals, who might see you potentially as competition because
Mhm.
you want to get the doctors from them, and certainly you'd want to sort of, when treatment needs to be in person, treatment needs to be physical, you want to be able to link them to services nearby. And secondly, with governments, how do you convince them to invest in it so that it's accessible? Because obviously the upper middle class who would be able to afford it, they're not they shouldn't, they're not the people who need the most per se. And the third one, I guess, is with people, how do you create demand with people who aren't tech savvy, who aren't medically or health literate, who might not be able to go through your modules per se?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for that question. Let's paint the spectrum of people involved in the healthcare ecosystem. And broadly speaking, as I said, there are two main categories: the people who have to pay for healthcare and the people who provide healthcare. And the people who have to pay for healthcare, again, three main groups: insurers, employers, and governments. And of course, the people who provide for healthcare can be doctors, but also pharmaceutical companies, right? And of course, in the middle are the patients themselves. Number one, as a startup, we have to be very focused. And who we choose to focus on immediately can make or break the entire model, because we don't have the resources to address everyone the same way. So focus and making choices is very important. Now, in this context, our choice is focus on the payers first, because the payers are the ones who are bearing the economic brunt and pressure of escalating double-digit costs in medical costs, right? And so going to see CEOs of insurance companies and employers to help validate that this is the problem that they're experiencing. What have they tried before? They're not happy with the results. Their costs are still going up. Are they willing to try new models to bring down that cost? And with a lot of things, you're going to have to talk to or make appointments to see 100 organizations, out of which only 20 will actually agree to see you, out of which only one or two will actually agree to start and do something and actually pay you money for your services. So number one, there is a rule of numbers. You've got to work hard and pound the pavement and get connected. Now, you're right. Hospitals and governments are probably the most reserved out of all of this, and they're going to take a lot more convincing. And generally speaking, when it comes to the providers, first, there maybe 90% of them are conservative, who want to see a lot of, I want to see all the evidence, the clinical research. Does this really work or not? Because I'm very possessive about my patients. That's 90%. But you can work hard to find that 10% early adopters, key opinion leaders, and influencers who understand the potential of digital therapeutics and are willing to work with you, for example, with clinical research projects, right? We've launched clinical research projects with doctors because they are feeling the pressure of their patients still not getting well, and they're willing to take on kind of or experiment with new technologies, and we can kind of document that process. Now, where for me the bridge, right? Because governments generally, their biggest constraint is they just don't have budget resources to be able to experiment with new things. So if you try to knock on that door for a long time, it's going to be a tough uphill battle. So what instead we've done is to look at the pharmaceutical companies who are supplying very important government contracts to the respective ministries of health, including, for example, the supply of insulin, the supply of hypertension medication, right? And that space is actually hyper competitive because insulin, diabetes medication, hypertension medication, they're commoditizing. There may be like 20 to 30 companies who would provide products. So how do you differentiate one from the other and convince government clinics and hospitals to sign up for your program, right? And these contracts are worth, a lot, like tens of millions of dollars. Now, if we tell them, hey, look, let's work together where we bundle their commodity pharmacotherapy product or a drug with Nullery as a digital therapeutic, so that, not only is it just simply about a commodity, because remember, only 26% of people actually follow through the prescribed medication that doctors give them, but an app where professionals are checking in on them almost on a daily basis, reminding them when they need to take medication, watching and guiding their food and managing their stress and sleep. That's going to lead to a better outcome, which means that pharmaceutical company can now have a competitive, differentiated offering relative to the other competitors, right? And therefore, in a way, if you don't wait for the government to pay for you, but the government will buy these services because they need those drugs, but we are now bundled as a partnership, as a way of then providing Nullery to a kind of a broader mass market audience. Now, lastly, you did mention, yes, some people are not digitally savvy, and Nullery is not a solution for everyone. You can't be all things to all people. But remember, Southeast Asia as a whole is already 80% connected in terms of mobile internet access. So that number is growing very, very fast, right? So the fact that we can address a very significant percentage who are digitally savvy. I mean, I'm sure you would have aunts, uncles, and even grandparents who are very, very active on various WhatsApp groups, right? And so the digital savviness is growing very rapidly. And so let's focus on that segment, which then frees up the overall healthcare ecosystem to provide care the traditional way to those who do not have yet that digital connectivity or the experience to use digital technologies.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Looking at the, yeah, I guess the next question I'd ask is just going back to more of therapy, and I'm not a professional when it comes to sort of allopathic treatment per se, but more of the psychological, because I can ask in that part. A lot of treatment, and a very key part about treatment is the empathy and the connection between the provider and the patient, right? And this is true both in terms of like cognitive behavioral therapy, and also in terms of even when you go and the conversation that you can have with your providers to say, I'm having these issues and this is, and having that to be explained. And I agree with you that a lot of sort of like cut and paste answers that you can give, because it's the same theory, the same explanations, the same medication that's going to be given out. But how do you have you found this as a problem, the problem of sort of treatments being less effective when there is less face-to-face, or less empathy when you do come across it, and how have you tried to resolve it per se?
Well, first, I'm going to agree with you that having that therapeutic relationship, that empathetic connection, is probably the number one factor for Nullery success. So first of all, Nullery has about a 60% success rate. So 40% of people who use this don't achieve their health goals. They're disconnected, they don't engage, or maybe digital is not for them, right? But again, 60% is comparable in terms of effectiveness as medication like metformin for diabetes or Cozar for hypertension. And so building that empathetic connection is important, which is why Nullery is not using chatbots. We don't believe in artificial intelligence being the primary interface. We believe that a real human is important for you, so that you know that there's an actual human, a name, a face, someone that you can talk to. But all the analytics is on the back end to help that human understand you faster and know exactly when and how to reach out to you. So we don't believe technology is anywhere near. We're probably decades away before you can actually replace that empathetic human connection. But remember, again, today, 90% of Southeast Asians do not get any kind of human connection at all, right? So while maybe Nullery may not be as effective as if you had your own personal psychologist that you can see face to face, live in person, but again, 90% of people don't have that access. So providing a digital access, which is maybe 60% as effective as that, means a lot more people are getting the care that they would otherwise not be able to get at all.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll just mix in with a question from the audience.
Sure.
And we'll be stepping back more from the specific discussion of healthcare and more of the business model that you use at Nullery.
Yep.
And so, Leonard is asking, from an earlier talk, Mr. Azran, you mentioned that Nullery operates in Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, etc. As a startup, how do you overcome the difficulties of expanding beyond one country? And how does ASEAN benefit you as a company in terms of policies or, economically speaking?
Wow. Okay, that's a really good question. And there's no sort of like real clear rule on this, except generally most investors will say you need to focus on one core country until you get to what's called a product market fit. Okay, because initially you've got to focus and make sure that the product you're building is acceptable in the market, and the real test is, will people actually pay you for that? And as a rough rule of thumb, investors in Southeast Asia will say, we want you to get to what's called a 1 million US dollar annual revenue run rate. Annual revenue run rate means basically that if, let's say, your monthly revenue is 83,000 US dollars a month, if you multiply that by 12 on an annualized basis, you've now crossed 1 million US dollars. That's when people use that as a rule of thumb to gauge that you're kind of already at that product market fit. And that's the time where you want to start thinking about expanding into other Southeast Asian markets. Now, the reality is, because a country like Malaysia is small, right? We don't have, 30 million is small relative to the rest of Southeast Asia. So we need scale, and we need to be able to go into the larger markets in Southeast Asia. I think the only exceptions that we've seen in Southeast Asia are Indonesia-focused startups, because their own domestic market, it is massive in terms of, almost 300 million people in in Indonesia alone. But for every other country, you have to learn, how do I expand to different markets in Southeast Asia? And that's what makes Southeast Asia complex, because unlike China or India or the US, we have different languages, different cultures, different regulatory systems, different infrastructures. And so we need to learn, how do we operate in terms of multiple markets? And that's why getting to that product market fit is important, because then your focus is just on scaling, rather than that early stage where you're trying to figure out, does my product really work or fit this particular market?
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. And just, and I'll go back now to some of the questions that I've prepared, focusing on your business model, and more specifically how you've engaged with the behavioral sciences, as you said, and the design technology. So my question is, specifically, would you like to briefly run through us, how do you incorporate, like you said, behavioral science and psychology into the services you provide? Is it beyond just do you, in terms of the interface, in terms of the design, how have you used sort of like intelligent design in your products in Naluri, and what effect has it had?
Okay, well, so as a psychology major, what I can share with you is we focus on two specific protocols. One, you mentioned earlier, cognitive behavioral therapy, and two, motivational interviewing. These are two proven evidence-based techniques that deliver real behavioral change in a statistically significant manner, like your P value is 0.001. So, for example, with cognitive behavior therapy, we've built a digital thought journal, which is kind of like a CBT worksheet, where you start by getting people to identify the emotions that they're experiencing, and then you guide them through a few thought processes in terms of why they're feeling that way. Could it be one of, for example, 8 thinking traps that they might be experiencing? And then how do you reframe them, right? And the psychologist will guide you as you go through this digital workbook. And the more thoughts that you log into the thought journal, we can then see patterns, right? Like, is it usually anger, 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 or is it fear, 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 so that we can then customize the interventions for you. So that is one application of a evidence-based psychological technique delivered in a digital way. Now, motivational interviewing is done slightly differently. It's not necessarily a user point, but in order to make it easier for the psychologist to work with people faster, because remember that speed and productivity is important for the economics, we've sort of broken down motivational interviewing, for example, into the 4 components. Open-ended questions. O, A, affirmation, right? R, how do you reflect and create cognitive dissonance? And then S, summarizing the action. So OARS. And so then, as the psychologist is kind of chatting with you, they're being guided along this framework, so that we move someone from kind of a state of maybe contemplating change but not quite ready, to one where they might be preparing for change, to then summarizing what are the actions that they're going to take, right? So those are kind of 2 examples of using existing psychological techniques and applying that in a digital manner.
Thank you for that. I think the next question will be, I'll be jumping back and forth between the audience and some of the questions I've had. Next question is from Iso. how have you found the fundraising landscape in Malaysia, Southeast Asia? And the second one is, do you think the outcome-based payment model works for other healthcare problems outside psychiatry, psychology, and diabetes? And what are the significant risks and problems that you foresee, using these outcome-based payment models?
Wow, they're two very, very different questions. So let's start with the first one on fundraising, because I'm actually in the process of trying to complete our Series A fundraising now. Of course, fundraising is by definition a challenge. It is hard, right? Because you're trying to match people with the right capital and your business idea or your product. And despite I raised hundreds of millions of dollars at AirAsia X, hundreds of millions of dollars at iFlix. You might have done it multiple times, but starting it's really hard, right? Like 60 to 70% rejections. So a lot of law of numbers. But interestingly, in the last 3 rounds of Naluri, what we found is the people who ultimately invested in us were ones that we've built a relationship well more than 1 year ago, which means we connected with them, not at the point that we needed capital from them, but just to kind of start telling them about what we're doing, updating them on the progress. For those investors where we say, hey, we're now in fundraising mode, let's send you our pitch or business plan and see whether you're going to react. They might ask you to pitch and they'll ask you a few questions, get into your data room, but virtually all of them do not end up investing in us. Those who do, certainly in this round and the ones last year, were the ones that we had built a relationship over time. So I can't overemphasize the importance of building a longer term relationship with prospective investors ahead of your actual fundraising round. So while we're now closing Series A, we've already identified 10 main Series B investors, because that's a different league. And we've started talking to them now so that when we raise money in the second half of 2022, it won't be the first time that they've seen us. They'll kind of see in our progression and whether we're actually doing what we say we're going to do. So that's kind of the general fundraising landscape. But I think Southeast Asia certainly has had a lot more capital come in over the last 2 years, a lot more funds across the whole seed stage, Series A, Series B, growth stage onwards. But of course, it's very competitive, right? Because there are tons and tons and tons of startups, everyone competing for that capital. So that's no different than Silicon Valley or London or Berlin or wherever, right? Yes, there's a lot of capital, but there's even more competition for it. Now, when it comes to the payment channel, trying to revamp a whole industry towards an outcomes-based model is hard, right? Today, 80-90% of our contracts are still based on a fixed fee, because most of the time when our clients work with us, they say, look, Azran, I don't know how to budget this thing. If it's quite variable, can we start with a basic fixed fee model so that we can get finance to approve it? But some of our earlier clients who are now in year 3, year 4 have seen the consistency of the track record. For example, the largest client that we have started with us in 2018, saw that 57% achieve a clinical outcome. 2019, that number is 62%. 2020, that number will be about 63%. So they can start to model the expected returns in terms of investing in a digital therapeutic like Naluri for their employees. And we're now starting to move towards an outcomes-based pricing model for them. But it will take a while. But insurers and employers are getting on board. They can start to see the value. And I think progressively we'll start to see more and more outcomes-based contracts.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. And now we'll be just focusing. I'm very mindful of the time. We've only got about 15 minutes or so left. I'll just be moving our focus a bit more wider to the elephant in the room, COVID and the pandemic. And yes, I'm sure the repercussions it's had, we could go on talking for hours. But very specifically, 2 questions. COVID-19, how has it affected your business specifically? Because I'd imagine the directions are quite different. How has it affected your business specifically? And how do you think it's affected, because we're speaking about Malaysia as well, how do you think it's differentially affected other Malaysian businesses across other industries? Would you mind painting us a picture?
So I'll start by saying it has had a massive positive effect, because demand for digital health has skyrocketed during COVID. But at the start, it was a different picture. It was very stark and challenging. Now, what's interesting is when Naluri first started and we really wanted to address the issue of digital mental health, to make mental health care much more accessible, we had no interest from the insurance companies or the employers, right? Because they were very focused on the main contributors for their medical cost escalations, which is diabetes, obesity, hypertension, heart diseases. And so mental health was this, so chronic disease was like a Trojan horse where we snuck in that psychological and behavioral health support, because as we helped them with their depression, anxiety, and stress, they became more confident to manage their lifestyles and ultimately better manage their blood sugar, cholesterol, and blood pressure. But with COVID, suddenly, now initially March, April, and early May, things were really tough because most corporate clients were in a, oh my God, what's happening? All budgets frozen. Things were really challenging. We had to take massive pay cuts, slash our costs just to try to survive. But later in May, things really picked up because employers were seeing by then the effect of burnout and depression and anxiety amongst their workforce, who now have to experience massive lifestyle disruptions with the work from home model. And they needed a digital mental health care provider. So suddenly we had many clients who said, Azran, I need mental health support. And it basically led to a tripling of our monthly revenues if you were to compare December against March, on the back of big pure mental health products. So sometimes in life you might start initially, you have to revamp or mix your product or value proposition because the market's not ready. But in this case, suddenly there was a new uptick because of COVID.
As they say in Malay, menjumpa rezeki, kan? Yeah. So, okay, let me just check the chat again and for any questions that we might have. Okay, don't have any questions from the chat at the moment. Yeah, okay. So we've spoken about the pandemic. Again, I'll just now go on and, sorry, it's a bit touch and go, but we have to talk about this. And, I've just read out your introduction and all the things that you have done. Really important question. How do you spread your own personal time? How do you, because I'm sure it's not easy to train for the Iron Man, and it's not easy to, write a book at the back of starting your own startups and jumping from industry to industry as you've done. So how do you spread your personal time, and what makes you make your decisions? What's your thinking process or your mantra per se?
Wow, okay, that's very good. Again, it's easy for me to try to summarize things in hindsight and make it look like I've got my whole life together. But the reality is, it is a kind of painful and a bit of a cluttered approach to it. But if I were to try to distill some principles, number one, I've learned not to take on challenges by myself, right? So very quickly assembling a team of people, because remember, they bring in industry expertise, they bring in specific functional expertise. My job, first of all, as a business builder, is to assemble the team and find the investors and get things started. But at the right time also to make sure I back off and don't try to micromanage people, right? Because my job is to be that 5-year-old kindergarten kid, probing them, asking, why were we doing it this way? Is there a different way of doing it? Breath is what I bring to the table. And breath means I need to constantly be out there connecting with people. That's why I'm active on social media. That's why I do a lot of speaking engagements, because it allows me to interact with people, tell them what I'm doing, and listen to their feedback, criticisms, and then go back to my team and say, hey, here's some new perspectives that I've garnered, right? So being very clear about my job and knowing that, my job is not to actually get too hands-on, because that's going to stifle my team. So that's number one principle. Number two, I think compartmentalizing. So for example, with physical workouts, part of my Ironman regime is workouts happen first thing in the morning, right? So if you wake up at 5:36, you work out weekdays, it's probably only about an hour workout. I'm done by 8. I've got the whole rest of the day for work, right? Because if I try to do workouts in the afternoon, it rarely ever happens. And then I've got my weekend mornings, Saturday mornings, Sunday mornings are for that. And the afternoons, either family, social life, or catching up with work. So kind of really compartmentalizing my life to try to get things done at the right time.
Yeah, have you ever considered doing an Azran module on your Naluri for people to, use and understand your lifestyle?
Well, so this is very interesting because one of the principles of leadership for me is I don't want to be making the same decision more than 5 times.
Mm.
And so every time I find myself being the making the same decisions, I'm the bottleneck. So I try to then document how would I decide, and then ask my team members, okay, if you follow this that I've written down, then you can decide by yourself. And then let's just do a monthly review with me, just so that we can calibrate whether they're making the right decisions or not. And one of the things that came out of that process was an Azran user guide. So there's an actual written user guide to Azran so that people can learn how do I work with Azran quicker instead of taking months to learn about all the kind of weird things and habits about Azran. Now they can kind of read up this 7-8 pager and get to know, okay, this is what's the best way to interact with Azran. So it does exist.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So I think the two things I've got, maybe just just to flash again to the audience, and I think this is something that Jordan Peterson's quite a controversial figure, but he's mentioned this and it reminded me of what you said, which is sort of not to be childish, to master your own skills and to master yourself is one thing, but at the same time not to be too uptight and to bring out your childlike nature, to be open, to share about things like that. And that's why things come across, to understand yourself well, but don't be too stuck up in your ways. And I think what you've said has really resonated with that fact. Okay, just we're coming up to a close recently, but I just want to go off. We have a verbal question, and I've been waiting for one from Eljo. Yeah, he's studying psychology with me at Oxford. Eljo, would you like to ask your question, please? Unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have a camera, but yeah, fantastic speech so far. I think your answers are very eloquent and very well put. Yeah, so on the topic of productivity and with the pandemic currently happening, how would you say, like, what are your top tips for staying productive without like having a physical divide between your workspace and your relaxation space? Do you have any like personal tips for that?
Well, if I were to give you one for today, is to be very wary of constantly task shifting. Because every time we shift from one task to the other, there's a higher cognitive overload, right? To switch and recalibrate. And unfortunately, the reason why work from home has become extremely stressful is people's attention span are constantly shifting, right? Because, for example, managers suddenly they don't know how to manage their teams remotely. They expect them to reply instantaneously to their WhatsApp messages or their calls, because if you're not replying to me, you must be watching Netflix or sleeping. And so people have to stop what they're doing and then actually have to respond. And so therefore, kind of being aware of that and being aware of the plague of notifications, right? Like beeps on Messenger or communication tools and emails, and constantly shifting our attention is probably the one energy drain that a lot of us are not aware of. And that's why it amplifies the stress. So therefore, bucketing things, right? For example, if I were to do emails, I'm going to spend 15 minutes only on emails, let's say from 9:30 to 9:45, 11:45 to 12, 2:30 to 2:45, maybe 5 to 5:15. So I kind of clear emails in batches and then I stop, I switch it off. Because if I allow email to run on my laptop or my phone, those notifications are going to be extremely distracting and drain a lot of energy. So I kind of bucket my tasks, focus on one thing at a time in about chunks of 15 to 25 minutes.
So it sounds like you're a devotee of Cal Newport's deep work.
Well, man, you guys have all the theory. I just kind of learned the hard way and lose all my hair in the process.
Wow. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Maybe we might invite you over to Oxford to do some experiments and to understand you better. No, I'm yeah, just joking. I think we'll take one last question from the chat before we wrap it up.
Sure.
And so it's a question from Federico. He has a question: was it difficult transitioning from the industries that you've mentioned, from the airline industry to the video streaming to the healthcare? That you have a partner in your team, but on a personal level, what were the challenges for you to constantly have to shift gear?
Yeah, it's definitely not easy. It's not for the faint-hearted, because you need to have a very high tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty. But my whole life has been about that, right? My whole career, part of starting in a consulting career, is you're thrown into new situations every few months. You've got to get up the learning curve very, very quickly by asking a lot of questions, reading a lot, and talking to a lot of people. So in that part, I've trained for the last 20 years to get to where I am over the last 10. So that's part one. And part two, again, to very quickly find a team to do this so that I'm not alone trying to figure this out, because I think that would be too daunting. So the first thing I did is just really making sure I've got the right team of co-founders with me, and they're the magic behind all the ideas and businesses that I've been involved with.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your answers. Thank you everyone who has asked all your questions, and thank you for joining us today. We'll be wrapping it up now, and yeah.